I believe we are streaming, and I'll share my screen. I always forget to because you probably just put me on a big monitor and it looks okay, but just in case. I'll forget to do it in another class and people scream at me. All right, so we've exploited something. Now it is time to move on to what we do after that. So post exploitation. And things we will want to do at that point, include establishing persistence. Weird. My pen doesn't want a pen. Whatever will I do? Ah! Terrifying. So establishing persistence, like making sure that we can connect to and stay connected to a system, move laterally within inside of a network. So if your target is your typical corporate network, there will be more systems in there for us to work with and take over and do bad things to. So establishing persistence gets you in the system, keeps you there. Lateral movement lets you move around after the fact. And then ideally, you should be covering your tracks afterwards to make sure that nobody knows what you were up to on that network. So persistence, you've got options. You can, if the way you got into a system, and I guess now is a little late to be introducing this, but the attack framework by MITRE, M-I, details all of the ways you can get into a network. And one of the ways that you can gain initial access is by using credentials. Right? You can get a valid account, and using that valid account, you can log into a system. So if you haven't explored this website, totally worth checking out. So this breaks down the techniques that folks have used in the past to do this and the various sub-accounts. But if you can obtain credentials of a local account by means of gaining initial access, those come in handy as accounts you can use for subsequent access. So it gives you the option to keep coming back. Otherwise, you can create a new account. So, you know, go in and make my maintaining access count, or get a little trickier by adding in things like creating a scheduled task on Windows or a cron job on a Unix-based system where you have that task either give you access or run an account or run a job to create account. In Windows, processes that run in the background without any user action are called services, and on Linux they're called daemons. And essentially they're just usually the programs that provide you like web serving or access to shared files and folders on Windows, things like that. So manipulating those to allow persistence to add either a fake version of that or whatever. Like a SSHD is a daemon that sits there and offers the SSH service. If you can replace the legitimate one with one that has a built-in backdoor account, you're off and running. Or installing some kind of Trojan horse program that lets you in there. So just giving yourself a way to maintain access to a system ongoing. And to come back to the MITRE attack framework, inside of the persistence list, there's even more ideas for you if you don't have enough. So creating authorized keys or a background transfer service job, putting things in login, playing with the registry. All of those are legitimate ways to keep your ability to get into a system after your initial compromise. So there's more than just that quick little list we had there. But broadly speaking, like, we hit the high notes. So in Windows, there's a bunch of different ways you can go about creating user accounts. We have entire Windows courses that talk about just this sort of thing. But a popular way to do that is using the net user option. So net user add and then providing a username will give you the like command line version of the local users and groups tool in order to add it in. So you have to be admin for that to work. But if you have access to a Windows machine and you either have Windows or PowerShell to work with administrative privileges, like, you've got the keys to the kingdom for that thing. From there, you can do net user. If it's connected to, so like net user, it'll tell you who's on the system. To create an Active Directory user, you can go in and use PowerShell. The AD user add, new AD user add is the commandlet you use to do that. I don't know if you can get away with it without actually doing it. The command in Linux is add user, where you enter in the username from a super user shell, or you can sudo add user to create a user on your system. So any of those, especially if it's a public-facing system, will give you access to get back in. Right now, you've got an account on the system that's your very own T. Russell account. Generally, not a good idea to use your existing username and password for somebody else's passwords. Otherwise, there's a lot of options in terms of like backdoors and Trojans. There are remote access Trojans or RAT toolkits that you can get your hands on that will give you the option to do all the things, to go through and create whatever kind of access you want. There are things you need to usually, like, you can buy them on the dark webs if you're so inclined. Or write your own if you're really feeling saucy. You can think of the like stuff you can do with Meterpreter as sort of a low-level remote access Trojan. So a not very fancy one, which will leave you a backdoor to get into a system. One of the things you're probably looking for in that kind of a setup is a remote access Trojan that like dials out. One of the things with persistence is, however it is you got into the system, you're now going to need to deal with like all the firewalls and network protections and potentially network detection systems that are involved. So finding a RAT that will like call out to some sort of command and control infrastructure is a good idea. We've talked a bunch about rootkits, again, usually available on the dark web, or feel free to write your own. Something that runs in startup and then hides itself from the operating system is usually how we differentiate a rootkit from anything else. Basically, it runs before the operating system runs, and potentially has the ability to hide itself from the operating system. So if you do a list of the directory that rootkit lives in, you won't have the actual rootkit in there because it will have hidden itself at the operating system level, and the operating system won't know about it. To detect those sorts of things, one way is like by detecting shenanigans going on the network, like the rootkit trying to phone home or whatever, or by comparing the list of all the directories on a system while it's running with the directories that exist on the system while it's booted off of trusted external media. So you set up a USB stick with an operating system. You get a complete list of all the files on the operating system while it's running. put it on the USB stick, turn the thing off, boot off of a known good USB, and compare and contrast those two. And that's one of the ways defenders will detect a rootkit. All of a sudden there'll be, you know, this folder in there called rootkit, haha, you can't see me or something, and there it is. In Windows and Linux, we mentioned services versus daemons. But if you've got some sort of malicious code written, or even not terribly malicious, it doesn't have to be super evil. If a system has like the netcat utility installed on it, you can use those services and run it as a daemon in order to either call out to the command and control infrastructure or to sit there and listen as a, you know, as a listener as opposed to something reversed, and give your system an opportunity to connect. And any of the other ways you can run software on a Windows or Linux box is an option for creating a backdoor. So task scheduler in Windows, cron jobs in Linux give you the options to have the system run your code. You know, task scheduler can kick off whenever, you know, you want, every Wednesday at 3 a.m. Cron jobs are the same deal. It's usually better to use actual legitimate software to do this than to have some sort of sneaky evil code. Right now, one of the best ways to deliver malware to a system is to write a nice Python script that basically just phones home, and to wrap that up in an executable which the malware people won't find. Ideally though, in the same way that authentication is important to blue teamers in terms of defending the network, the red teamers don't want to give up their command and control infrastructure either. So it's important to have some sort of authentication going on, or you'll wind up with the problem that the folks who were exploiting all of those Exchange servers had, and the FBI will come along and shut down all of your connections. I just read this morning that they had been doing that to the infrastructure for a bunch of those Exchange attacks. They'd gone through and used the backdoor that the attackers left open to shut down the backdoor, essentially. So if you've made your way inside of a network, you know, you've bypassed the firewall and you get onto somebody's computer, or you've tricked somebody into running malware and now you have access to them, the time has come to start looking around the network for other systems to compromise from the system that you've gained initial access to. And we usually call it lateral because you're not necessarily moving up the food chain, but just around to other systems. So things that you should look for include telnet or rlogin or RSH, which I subjected you guys to earlier in the class. Sort of older protocols, not very secure protocols, but on like crappy Internet of Things stuff or industrial control systems or old systems that can't be upgraded for one reason or another, you'll still find them out there. So, or poorly configured things like Cisco devices do telnet by default, and they really should be doing SSH because it's not that much more work to set up. Speaking of, the secure shell, if you've got credentials to log into something, great. You also have to watch out for the remote desktop protocol, or ARD, for, I believe that's Apple's desktop protocol. X11 forwarding is how you forward X Windows, which is the GUI system for Linux. Virtual network computing, still my favorite way to remote administer systems on a local area network, although I've been trying to wean myself off of it and use things like other things that you could use for lateral movement, Team Viewer. You could use, Google's now got a remote Google or Chrome remote desktop. And then VNC is virtual network computing. The folks at Bell Labs developed it for it was one of the very early screen share tools, and it's cross-platform, which is kind of nice. So you could administer a Linux box with it or a Windows box using the same protocol. And then SMB or server message block is Microsoft's file and print sharing tool protocol. On Windows, you've also got the advantage of there being a bunch of infrastructure built into it to allow the administrator of a network to do stuff remotely to computers. So things like remote procedure calls and DCOM allow an administrative user to connect to a remote system and do things to it. Same thing with like Windows Management Instrumentation, WMI. Windows RM is a tool for you can use with PowerShell, as is PSExec. So if they are configured on a system, you have the option of getting into all sorts of trouble with them. So PowerShell or PS remoting is much the same as a SSH session. So if you have a computer that's running PowerShell and letting folks remote into it, you can then get an interactive, a command line shell on a system that doesn't have SSH or RDP running. There's a bunch of steps you need to go through. It needs to be able to get to the system in question. At PowerShell, you can turn on remoting and allow folks to connect to it, enable PS remoting force. And then you need to have those systems set up so that they are trusted. And then make sure that each target is doing that by testing it. And if it's all working the way you want it to work, Viola. So you provide credentials, you can enter a interactive shell, or if you're just doing like you want to run one single command, you can go through and launch that. And there are tools that automate this whole process for you, like PowerShell Empire, which is a tool like framework designed to help you go through and do all sorts of fun Windows exploitation, doing things with our friend Mimikatz. The other, what's it called? Death Star uses PowerShell Empire plus other stuff to sort of just basically automate the process of owning Windows domains. So you can gain control of a domain and API basically using just pre-built TTPs. I'll throw those links into this discussion or into this lecture note. So remote management is a great big deal. But doing it yourself as opposed to or doing it with living off the land as opposed to doing it with something else is a quieter way to do so and less likely to get detected. Also, speaking of living off the land, oops, Lowell Tools Silverweights, what? How about Lowell Tools hacking? Oh no, apparently it's so much League of Legends, it's hard to get there. So there are also pre-built binaries you can use for Linux to do all of this kind of stuff. And a bunch of pre-built things. So if you're not like using super sketchy, MSF admin tools, you will do a better job of this, which is evading the detections. Right? You went through all the trouble of going out and gathering info on folks. You do not, or on folks, on networks, you do not want to be drawing any unnecessary attention to yourself. So you didn't do it while you were gathering info. Try not to do it while you're connecting to things. So keep in mind how, you know, a SSH session is going to look to the folks analyzing the network. You know, think small, not lots of network traffic. And if, where possible, the goal of evading detection is making sure that you might be in a position now to understand a little bit of the network, so you will potentially know if the network is monitored, and if so, by what. So you can take that into account where, you know, what kind of stuff you'll be looking at. If possible, and if within scope on an engagement, maybe just turn off the anti-malware on a system. I wanted to run a sketchy version of what's it called? Process Hacker. And to get it to install, I had to disable the, I had to disable the thing because I wanted the ability to inject DLLs into things, which apparently they don't do anymore. So I disabled the Windows Defender for just that folder that the Process Hacker needed to live in, because it's kind of malware, not really. So after your exploitation, you're going to want to know how to make sure that you're not leaving any records. So what kind of log files you're creating and what kind of files you're leaving behind. I frequently tell the story of a incident response job I worked on where the folks didn't understand how the bash history worked and left all of the commands to connect to their infrastructure sitting around in the bash history files of the compromised server. Not a good thing to do. So it does help to know how Linux works. In Windows, they'll be writing to the system log. So be aware that, you know, moving things around, adding users, all that kind of stuff are going to add log files. If the adversary you're working against has any kind of monitoring, those things usually are big red flags when people start adding users and stuff. So have enough knowledge of the network to know what it is you're supposed to do. After that, if you've used tools to get in, get rid of them. Don't keep them on the system. If they're laying around, you might want to do more than just throw them in the recycle bin. And logs are designed to be hard to manipulate. So in Windows, it's much easier to clear out an entire log file than it is to delete a couple of entries from it. The problem with that is now you've deleted the entire log file and people are like, what happened to my logs? That's odd. So it's going to raise some questions. But essentially, the more you can do to you know, not leave evidence lying around on systems, the better off your life will be. Again, if it's in scope. Finally, it is nice to clean these things up. So you go through and undo and Control-Z all the shells and services and backdoors you may have created. Get rid of any accounts you created, any credentials you put in there, spyware, tools, that kind of stuff. If you made configuration changes, restore them to the original state. It is probably a good practice if you are on an engagement that hasn't specified this to make copies of the logs and the files that you're going to move or delete or modify so that they have the originals when you're done. Remember, you're a guest on this network. Even though they invited you in to do this pen test, you're still not supposed to be jacking things up. A particularly sticky situation can arise if you're bumping around on a network and you notice that there are critical security vulnerabilities. You might want to address that with the management and say, hey guys, so we found this thing while we were blundering around on your network that could potentially get you into trouble. Consider that. So there's all the things. You know how to exploit hosts now. Bunch of the common vulnerabilities that you're going to find out there. Device hardware, how virtual systems are detected, how to get shell access to a host and do privesc, how to get credentials and then use that for lateral movements, and then ultimately establish some persistent, move around on the network, cover your tracks, and provide a wonderful pen testing report to your customers. Told you that wouldn't be short. Questions?